The ground moved, not as a figure of speech, not as a poet's metaphor, not as a theological symbol written centuries after the fact by someone reaching for language grand enough to match the moment. The ground actually moved. Stones split, the earth cracked, and something tore inside the most sacred room in the ancient world. Most people, when they picture the crucifixion, see a single image: a man on a cross, a darkened sky, and a handful of grieving figures at the foot of a hill. That image, shaped by centuries of paintings and stained glass, is quieter than the actual event, more contained, more manageable. But the historical record, both biblical and extra-biblical, describes something far more violent and far more strange. What actually happened to the physical world the moment Jesus died? Why would an earthquake occur at precisely that second? What does it mean that tombs opened and the dead were seen walking through Jerusalem? And why did the curtain in the temple, a curtain so heavy it took hundreds of priests to move, tear completely in two, from top to bottom, in a single instant? Stay until the end, because understanding this changes how we read the Gospels. It changes what the crucifixion actually was, not only spiritually, but cosmically, materially, and historically. These were not decorative details. They were signals written in the language of the ancient world, a language every person standing in Jerusalem that afternoon would have understood immediately, instinctively, with dread. If this kind of deep historical reconstruction of the world of Jesus strengthens your faith and sharpens your reading of Scripture, consider subscribing to this channel, because this is exactly the kind of journey we take here, week after week, going beneath the surface of the biblical text into the world where it was lived. To understand what happened at the moment of Christ's death, you have to understand what kind of city Jerusalem was on that particular Friday afternoon in the spring of somewhere around 30 or 33 AD. It was Passover. The city, which in ordinary times housed perhaps 80,000 people, had swelled to something between 2 and 3 times that number. Pilgrims had been arriving for days from across Judea, Galilee, the diaspora communities of Alexandria, Antioch, Babylon, Rome. They came on foot, in caravans, with animals, with children. The streets were dense with bodies, with the smell of roasting lamb already beginning to rise from courtyards and open fires, with the sound of Hebrew prayers murmured under breath and shouted from rooftops. The city was alive in the way that only a city packed to its absolute limit can be alive. Loud, warm, edged with exhaustion and anticipation in equal measure. And at the northwestern edge of the city, just outside the walls near one of the main gates, was a hill the locals called Golgotha. The word means skull. Some have argued the name came from the hill's shape. Others suggest it came from the fact that the bones of executed criminals were sometimes left exposed there. Both explanations may be simultaneously true. It was not a secret place. It was not a hidden place. It was a public place, visible from the road, chosen deliberately by Roman authorities because crucifixion was theater. It was meant to be seen. The Romans had been crucifying people in this province for decades. It was their standard tool for dealing with insurrection, rebellion, and public disorder. Crucifixion was designed not merely to kill, but to humiliate, to strip away every layer of dignity and privacy from a human being and leave them exposed, immobile, and suffering in full view of anyone who passed. The victims were typically left on the cross for days. The birds came. The process was meant to be a statement about Roman power and what happened to those who challenged it. On that particular Friday, 3 men were crucified on that hill. The Gospels record that the other 2 were described as criminals or bandits. The Greek word used, lestes, could mean either a common robber or a political insurgent. The man in the center was Jesus of Nazareth. Around the 9th hour, roughly 3 in the afternoon by modern reckoning, using the Roman method of counting from sunrise, something shifted in the atmosphere. It had already been dark for 3 hours. This detail from the Synoptic Gospels has always attracted scrutiny, because darkness at midday during Passover, which by Jewish calendrical reckoning always occurred near a full moon, cannot be a solar eclipse. A solar eclipse requires a new moon. This was a different kind of darkness. Ancient sources outside the Gospels, including a fragment attributed to a historian named Thallus, writing around 52 AD, and referenced by Julius Africanus in the 3rd century, appear to mention an unusual darkness in connection with events in Judea, though the textual transmission of these references is complex and debated. What is clear is that Matthew, Mark, and Luke all independently record the darkness as beginning at noon and lasting 3 hours, suggesting this was not an incidental detail, but a central feature of how the event was remembered and transmitted by eyewitnesses. Darkness at Passover, in the vocabulary of the Hebrew prophets, carried immediate meaning. The Book of Amos contains a passage, well known to any observant Jew of the 1st century, that reads, "And on that day, declares the Lord God, I will make the sun go down at noon and darken the earth in broad daylight. I will turn your feasts into mourning and all your songs into lamentation." Amos was addressing a vision of divine judgment. When darkness fell over Jerusalem at noon on the day of Passover, in a city packed with people who had memorized the prophets, the atmospheric signal would not have been lost on anyone. And then, at the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice and gave up his spirit. And the earth moved. The earthquake that followed the death of Jesus was not, in the ancient world, a neutral geological event. To understand why, you have to understand how people in the 1st century Mediterranean world, Jewish, Roman, and Greek alike, interpreted the movement of the earth. In the modern imagination, an earthquake is a tectonic event. Plates shift beneath the surface. Pressure builds along fault lines and releases. It is a physical phenomenon with a physical explanation, and its timing in relation to human events is understood to be coincidental. That framework did not exist in the ancient world, not because ancient people were primitive or incapable of observation, but because their cosmological framework was fundamentally different. The earth, in both Jewish and Greco-Roman thought, was a responsive creation. It was not inert material. It was a created order with a relationship to the events unfolding on its surface, particularly to events of cosmic significance involving divine judgment, divine presence, or divine action. In the Hebrew scriptures, earthquakes appear consistently at moments of theophany, moments when God acts directly in the world. The earth shook at Sinai when the law was given. The earth opened at the rebellion of Korah. The Psalms describe the mountains trembling, the foundations of the world shaking, the deep responding to the voice of God. The book of Isaiah uses seismic language to describe divine judgment. Therefore, I will make the heavens tremble, and the earth will be shaken out of its place at the wrath of the Lord of hosts. The prophet Zechariah, writing in a passage that would have been on the minds of many Messianic Jews in the 1st century, specifically connects a great earthquake with events on the Mount of Olives in the end times. An earthquake at the death of a man who had, 3 days earlier, ridden into Jerusalem to messianic acclaim, who had been declared King of the Jews in the charge nailed above his head, who had spoken of the temple's destruction and the coming of the Son of Man on the clouds of heaven. An earthquake at that precise moment would not have required interpretation for the people standing on that hill or in those streets or in that temple. The earth was speaking. The fault geology of the Jerusalem region is well established by modern research. The city sits near the Dead Sea Transform, one of the more seismically active fault systems in the Near East. Earthquakes in this region are historically documented across multiple centuries, with major seismic events recorded in 749 AD, 1202 AD, 1546 AD, and in the 20th century. A 2012 geological study published in the International Geology Review by Jefferson Williams and colleagues examined sediment cores from the Engedi Spa near the Dead Sea and identified a seismic event that could be dated to the 1st century AD, specifically to the range of 2636 AD, which falls precisely within the range of the dates most commonly assigned to the crucifixion. The laminated sediment layers, disrupted by what geologists identify as earthquake activity, provide physical evidence entirely independent of the biblical text. This does not prove the earthquake recorded in Matthew's Gospel. What it does is establish that the geological context is real, that the region was seismically active during this period, and that an earthquake in Jerusalem during the Passover of approximately 30-33 AD is not historically implausible. It is, in fact, consistent with what the geological record preserves. But Matthew's account does not simply record an earthquake. It records something more specific and more troubling: the splitting of rocks. The area around Jerusalem is dominated by limestone, the pale, dense, cream-colored stone from which the city itself was built, from which tombs were carved, from which the Temple Mount's foundational platform was constructed. Limestone fractures along bedding plains. A sufficiently powerful seismic event in the Judean hill country does not merely shake the surface. It splits the exposed rock formations, creating visible fissures that can persist for centuries. Pilgrims visiting Jerusalem in the early centuries of the Christian era reported being shown at Golgotha a visible crack in the rock beneath the site of the crucifixion. Whether this crack existed at the time or was identified retrospectively, its presence in the landscape was taken as a material witness to what had happened there. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, built by Constantine in the 4th century, was constructed partly in response to the identification of this site. And the rock formation visible within the church today beneath the traditional site of Golgotha shows a significant fissure that is acknowledged by geologists as consistent with seismic activity. The ground itself, in other words, preserved a scar, but the splitting of rocks was not the most theologically charged event recorded in the Gospels at the moment of Jesus' death. That distinction belongs to the curtain. The temple in Jerusalem in the 1st century was not a single room. It was a complex of courts, gates, porticos, and chambers arranged in a series of concentric zones of increasing holiness. The outermost court, the court of the Gentiles, was accessible to anyone. Moving inward, access became progressively restricted. Jewish men, Jewish women, priests, the high priest alone. At the innermost point of the temple structure stood the Holy of Holies, the Devir, the innermost chamber that in the theology of Second Temple Judaism was understood as the literal dwelling place of the divine presence on earth, the place where heaven and earth met. Separating the outer sanctum, the Heikel, or holy place, from the Holy of Holies was a curtain. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing in the late 1st century, describes this curtain in extraordinary detail. It was, he writes in his Jewish War, a Babylonian tapestry embroidered in blue, scarlet, and purple, decorated with a panoramic image of the heavens. It was, by his account, approximately 60 feet high. The Mishnah, compiled later but drawing on temple-era traditions, describes the curtain's thickness as a handbreadth, roughly 4 inches, and records that it was so heavy it required 300 priests to handle it during washing. Whether those precise measurements are taken as literal or as ancient hyperbole, communicating the curtain's extraordinary weight and significance, the underlying point is consistent across multiple sources. The curtain was massive, it was dense, and it was the physical boundary between the accessible world and the unapproachable presence of God. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all record that this curtain tore at the moment of Jesus' death, from top to bottom. That detail is not incidental. In the ancient world, the direction of a tear carried meaning in the same way that the direction of a gesture or the position of a body carried meaning. It communicated agency. Who initiated the action? Who held the power in this moment? A curtain torn from the bottom upward suggests human hands reaching, grasping, pulling. A curtain torn from the top downward suggests something else entirely. It suggests that the force came from above, that the tearing was not an act of vandalism or protest or desperation from below, but an act of opening from the other side. The early Christian communities who transmitted this detail across decades before it was written into the Gospels understood exactly what they were preserving. They were not recording a piece of temple property damage. They were recording a theological event written in physical material, the boundary between God and humanity, the barrier that had stood at the center of Jewish worship for centuries had been removed. And it had been removed not by human hands, but from the direction of heaven itself. But to feel the full weight of this, you have to understand what that curtain meant in the lived religious experience of the people standing in Jerusalem that afternoon. For a first-century Jewish man or woman, the temple was not a church in the modern sense, a building you entered on a scheduled day to participate in a communal ritual, and then left to return to ordinary life. The temple was the axis of the cosmos. It was the place where the sacrificial system that maintained the covenant between God and Israel was enacted day after day, morning and evening, without interruption. It was the place where sin was atoned for, where the calendar was regulated, where the agricultural cycle was consecrated, where the identity of the Jewish people as a covenant people was performed and renewed continuously. The Holy of Holies at the center of that system was entered once per year by one person, the high priest, on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. He entered alone. He entered after elaborate purification rituals. He entered with incense burning to obscure his vision. Because the tradition held that no human being could look directly upon the divine presence and survive. Some accounts suggest he wore bells on the hem of his robe so that those waiting outside could hear that he was still moving, still alive. Some accounts suggest a rope was tied to his ankle so that if he died inside, if he had entered impure, if something had gone wrong, his body could be retrieved without anyone else having to enter. This was the sacred geography that the curtain protected and defined. Every Jewish person in Jerusalem that Passover afternoon, and there were hundreds of thousands of them, knew exactly what that space was. Every priest performing the afternoon sacrifice in the temple courts knew. The Gospel of Luke, in a detail unique to his account, specifically mentions that a large group of priests became believers in the period following the resurrection. This detail has puzzled some readers, but it makes a particular kind of historical sense when you consider what those priests would have witnessed or heard reported within hours on that Friday afternoon. Men whose entire professional and religious identity was organized around the sanctuary and its boundaries. Men who would have understood, in the vocabulary of their training and their theology, exactly what the tearing of that curtain meant. Josephus, in his account of the years leading up to the Jewish War of 66–70 AD, records a series of portents and omens that he says occurred in the temple in the decades following the crucifixion. He mentions, among other things, that the massive bronze gate of the inner court, a gate so heavy it required 20 men to open and close it, was found standing open one morning on its own, having apparently unlocked and swung wide during the night. He records that priests serving in the inner courts heard voices saying, "Let us depart from hence." These accounts appear in the Jewish War, Book 6, and Josephus presents them as divine signs of the temple's impending destruction. Whether one reads them as historically factual or as literary conventions of ancient historiography, their presence in a Jewish source, one with no theological motive to support Christian claims, indicates that the temple's final decades were understood, even by non-Christian contemporaries, as marked by unusual and ominous events. The curtain's tearing fits within this broader pattern of what the first century remembered as a period of extraordinary disturbance around the temple and its sacred spaces. And then there are the tombs. Matthew's Gospel contains one of the most startling and least discussed passages in all of the New Testament. In chapter 27, verses 52 and 53, immediately following the record of the earthquake and the splitting of rocks, Matthew writes that the tombs were opened and the bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. He adds that they came out of the tombs after the resurrection of Jesus and went into the holy city and appeared to many people. This passage has generated centuries of theological and historical debate. It appears only in Matthew. It raises immediate questions. Who were these holy people? How many? Who saw them? Why does no other gospel mention this? And why does no other contemporary source, Jewish, Roman, or otherwise, record an event that would seem nearly impossible to overlook or ignore? These are legitimate questions, and honest engagement with the text requires acknowledging them rather than smoothing over them. What can be said with confidence is this: the passage is consistent with a specific strand of Jewish apocalyptic theology that was alive and active in the first century. In that theological framework, the resurrection of the dead was not understood as a future event happening in isolation. It was understood as part of the great transformation of the age, the moment when God acted decisively to restore creation and vindicate the righteous. The prophet Ezekiel had given Israel a vision of dry bones rising in a valley. The book of Daniel spoke of a time when many who slept in the dust of the earth would awake. The resurrection of the dead was not a foreign concept or a shocking novelty for first-century Jews. It was the expected signature of the age to come. What Matthew appears to be recording is something that the earliest Christian community understood as the first tremor of that age, the beginning of the general resurrection, inaugurated by the resurrection of Jesus himself, manifesting in a preliminary and partial way in the immediate aftermath of his death. The tombs opening at the earthquake, the dead stirring, and then, after his own resurrection on the third day, appearing in Jerusalem as witnesses to what had begun. Whether one reads this as literal, as visionary, as a theological statement expressed in the narrative conventions of apocalyptic literature, or as something else entirely, its placement in the Gospel is not accidental. It is the culmination of a series of cosmic signs: darkness, earthquake, torn curtain, opened tombs, each of which, in the vocabulary of the Hebrew prophets and the apocalyptic tradition, pointed toward a single overwhelming conclusion. Something irreversible had just happened to the world. The people who were present in Jerusalem that afternoon experienced these events in real time, with real bodies, in a real city. They did not have the benefit of theological frameworks developed over centuries of subsequent reflection. They had only what was in front of them: a man dying on a cross, a sky that had gone dark at noon, and then, at the moment of his death, the ground moving beneath their feet. Consider what that sequence of sensory experience would have been. The darkness came first. It did not creep in gradually the way evening comes. It came at midday, when the sun should have been at its highest point in the Passover sky. For 3 hours, the city existed in a premature and unnatural night. The crowds around the cross did not disperse. The Gospels record that people stood and watched. Some mocked, some wept, some simply stood. But the darkness held them in place, the way that unusual atmospheric events have always held human beings in place. With a combination of fear, fascination, and the instinctive sense that something larger than themselves was occurring. Then, the cry. Matthew and Mark both record that Jesus cried out with a loud voice just before he died. The Aramaic words, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, a direct quotation from the opening verse of Psalm 22. Some bystanders misheard or misunderstood, thinking he was calling for Elijah. The cry was loud enough to be heard clearly at the foot of the cross. It was not the weakened exhalation of a man whose body had already surrendered. It was a shout. The Roman centurion standing directly in front of the cross, a soldier who had presumably witnessed many crucifixions and knew precisely what the process of dying on a cross looked like and sounded like, responded to that cry and to what followed it with a statement that Mark records as, "Truly, this man was the Son of God," a Roman soldier, a professional witness to state execution, using the language of divine sonship at the moment of death. And then the earth moved. Imagine standing on the stone-paved street outside the Damascus Gate when the shaking began. The limestone buildings around you groan. The packed earth of the road shifts. People stumble. Animals panic and pull against their tethers. The sound of cracking stone carries through the air. Sharp, percussive, coming from multiple directions, in a city already suspended in the strange weight of 3 hours of unnatural darkness. An earthquake would not have been experienced as a random geological event. It would have been experienced as confirmation, as answer, as the world responding to something that had just ended on that hill outside the walls. And inside the temple, at that same moment, something was happening that no one outside the inner precincts would have witnessed directly, but that would have been known within hours, spreading through the priestly networks and the Levitical staff and the hundreds of temple workers who maintained that complex. The curtain had torn. The boundary had been breached. The most protected space in the known Jewish world had been opened, not by human hands, not by enemy invasion, not by institutional decision, but by a force that acted from above downward in an instant. At the precise moment, a man outside the city walls breathed his last. The high priest serving that Passover would have been Caiaphas, the same man who had presided over the overnight trial of Jesus, who had declared his death necessary, who had told the council that it was better for one man to die than for the whole nation to perish. Within hours of that execution, Caiaphas would have been informed that the curtain he was responsible for maintaining, the curtain that defined the boundaries of his authority and the sacred geography of his entire religious world, had been destroyed. What that moment meant for him personally, the historical record does not preserve. But the weight of it does not require documentation to be felt. The Roman centurion's response is worth dwelling on. He was not a Jew. He had no framework of Hebrew prophecy, no memory of the Psalms, no apocalyptic expectation. He was a career military officer serving in an occupied province, doing his job, overseeing an execution. And yet the sequence of events he witnessed, the darkness, the cry, the earthquake, the manner of the death itself, produced in him a declaration that is, theologically speaking, the most precise statement in the crucifixion narrative. This is consistent with a pattern visible throughout the Gospel accounts. The people who recognize Jesus most clearly are often those least expected to do so. A Roman soldier at the foot of the cross, a Samaritan woman at a well, a tax collector in a tree, a thief dying beside him who, in his final hours, perceived something that the religious establishment had refused to see across 3 years of public ministry. The centurion had no theology. He had only what he had seen with his own eyes across the course of that afternoon. And what he had seen was enough. There is a moment in Psalm 22, the psalm Jesus quoted from the cross, that is almost always overlooked in discussions of the crucifixion. The psalm begins in desolation. My God, why have you forsaken me?" It moves through a detailed description of suffering that reads, to a first-century Jewish reader familiar with crucifixion, with an almost unbearable specificity. Bones out of joint, strength dried up like a potsherd, hands and feet pierced, garments divided by lot. The suffering is total, and the sense of abandonment is absolute. And then the psalm turns. In its second half, Psalm 22 becomes a psalm of vindication, of proclamation, of universal scope. All the ends of the earth will remember and turn to the Lord, and all the families of the nations will bow down before him. The desolation of the opening does not have the last word. The psalm moves, as the day itself moved, from darkness toward something else. Jesus, dying on the cross and quoting the opening line of this psalm, was not simply expressing despair. In the Jewish tradition of his time, to quote the opening line of a psalm in a liturgical context was to invoke the entire psalm. Every person at the foot of that cross who knew their scripture, and many did, would have heard those words and known where the psalm went. They would have known that the man quoting it from the cross was not only voicing abandonment, he was voicing the full arc of the text, the desolation and the vindication together, in a single breath, at the moment of death. What happened to the earth when Jesus died was not a collection of dramatic special effects added by later editors to enhance a story. Each element, the darkness, the earthquake, the torn curtain, the opened tombs, spoke in the specific language of the world that produced them, a language woven from centuries of Hebrew prophecy, temple theology, apocalyptic expectation, and the lived material reality of first-century Jerusalem. The darkness said, "This is a day of divine judgment," as the prophets described. The earthquake said, "God is acting directly in the world, as God acted at Sinai." The torn curtain said, "The boundary between God and humanity has been permanently altered from above by divine initiative." The opened tombs said, "The age to come has begun its arrival. The resurrection of the dead has been set in motion." And the Roman centurion, standing in the middle of all of it, with no theological training and no prophetic framework, only his own eyes and the evidence of what he had just witnessed across the course of one extraordinary afternoon, said the one thing that all of those signs, taken together, were saying. Truly, this man was the Son of God. The earth had spoken. The temple had spoken. The sky had spoken. And a soldier who had no reason to say it, and every professional reason to say nothing, had said it too. The world in that moment did not fall silent. It broke open. And what came through the break, what poured through the torn curtain, through the cracked rock, through the opened tombs, through the words of a Roman soldier standing in the ruins of an afternoon he would never forget, was not the end of something. It was the beginning.